analysis that shows that for 2024, for every dollar in premiums that insurance companies took in, they paid out or expected to pay out $1.05. So 5% more in payouts than what they took in, meaning that they'll be constantly underwater here. So, I mean, I do wonder, Dave, can both of you have really emphasized the role of climate change throughout this conversation, which of course is not just a California problem. It is not just a Florida problem. It's an everyone problem. Have the fundamentals of what it costs to insure homeowners changed so much that has this problem become bigger than the private sector can manage?
The problem is certainly bigger, but I also think there are things the private sector can and should do to make insurance more available. I don't know where that figure of $1.05 comes from, but I know in California, the carriers for the last 6 years have been making positive underwriting returns. In addition to requiring insurers in their modeling to account for mitigation, not just in pricing, right? You don't get to the discount if they won't write you the insurance. It has to be incorporated into their models to make decisions about writing and renewing, as Carmen and I just spoke to. But in addition to that, insurers have the right to bring lawsuits against the oil and gas companies for their contribution to the losses that the insurers have. It's called a right of subrogation, and they should bring those lawsuits. They've done it in the utility context, they did it in the opioid context, they did it in the big tobacco context. They ought to do it in the oil and gas context, where the science is really clear that it's those emissions that are a major contributor to their losses. And then also, insurance companies in the United States have over $500 billion invested in the fossil fuel industry, and they're insuring the fossil fuel industry. So why are we allowing insurance companies to invest in the very industry, the fossil fuel industry, whose emissions are making it increasingly challenging for the insurance company to write insurance in many parts of the United States? Here too, state legislatures and governors need to stand up and say, look, you're pulling out of my state. We're not going to let you keep investing in the very industry, the fossil fuel industry, that's driving your challenge in writing insurance. So there are things the industry can and should do.
But couldn't you make the same argument then to, I don't know, the U.S. Forest Service for a century of forest management practices that have contributed to, ecosystems across the West that are tinder boxes? Couldn't you make the same claim on, cities themselves and their zoning that maybe have made them less resilient to fire? There's a lot of places to point the finger here. I'm not seeing that as a fix for the industry to keep homeowners insured, Dave.
Well, in fact, the insurance companies in California claimed and got $11 billion from PG&E as a result of the 2018 Camp Fire, and other billions from other utilities that were causes of wildfires that caused them losses. And that helped to mitigate to some extent the losses that they were seeing and helped them reduce to some extent the amount of rate increases they might otherwise have sought. So I'm not saying that they should limit where they're going to seek recovery, but I am saying they're ignoring completely the oil and gas industry, and they ought to be going after that industry as well for its contribution to this problem.
Well, Dave Jones is the director of the Climate Risk Initiative at the University of California, Berkeley's Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, and a former California Insurance Commissioner. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dave.
My pleasure.
And Carmen Balber, Executive Director of Consumer Watchdog, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting consumer and taxpayer interests. Carmen, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from the Museum of Science in Boston, dedicated to inspiring a lifelong love of science in everyone, in museums, classrooms, and online, offering engineering design challenges, digital experiences, live presentations, and more. mos.org. And BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy and helping clients find balance. Clients are matched with one of 30,000 therapists for online therapy from anywhere at betterhelp.com/public.
KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham. Well, it's Friday and it's almost noon, therefore, almost time for KUOW's Week in Review. Here's your host, Bill Radke.
Good to be here. We are 1 week in now or so of the Trump administration, and of course there's some conflict between the president's priorities and Washington state priorities. We'll discuss that. Ichiro is in the Hall of Fame, but not unanimously. The Washington State ferry system, also not in the Hall of Fame. That is unanimous. But how could the ferry system be fixed? And what could you smile about this week? We always end the show that way. We will again today, and I hope you'll stay tuned for it.
43 degrees and sunny in South Seattle. Expect a sunny afternoon with a high of 45.
Support for KUOW comes from Bloodworks Northwest. January is National Blood Donor Month. 1,000 donors are needed each day to ensure blood is available for cancer, accident, and surgery patients. Appointments take about an hour and are available at bloodworksnw.org. Community ready. And from Cascade PBS, presenting Explore the Outdoors Family Fair, a chance to meet organizations making outdoor recreation accessible to underserved communities. Workshops and activities for all ages. February 1st at Washington Hall. More at cascadepbs.org/events.
Wherever the day takes you, the KUOW mobile app is here to keep you company. Listen to Morning Edition on your morning walk.
Thanks for joining us on Morning Edition.
Browse our local podcasts like Seattle Now and Sound Politics on the light rail. Hear an amazing story? Send it to a friend with just a few taps. Download the KUOW app, available on iOS and Android.
Hey food lovers, join me, Francis Lamb, and KUOW for a special live taping of The Splendid Table on April 17th at Town Hall Seattle. Get your tickets today at KUOW.org/events.
KUOW live events sponsored by Finney Ridge Painting and BECU.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Janine Herbst. President Trump says he will sign an executive order to reform, overhaul, or possibly close the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, saying it's too slow and bureaucratic.
We're getting the Army Corps of Engineers all set. You need your riverbanks fixed. You need a lot of roads fixed, and we're going to get it done in rapid time.
He says states need to take care of their own natural resources, and they know best what they need. Trump made the comments in North Carolina earlier today, where he toured the months-long recovery from the remnants of Hurricane Helene. Catastrophic flooding destroyed homes and buildings and killed 266 people. Trump is now heading to California, where he will tour wildfire damage in and around Los Angeles and meet with Governor Gavin Newsom. He says he will provide aid to that state, but only if California implements voter ID and loosens its environmental laws. Trump has criticized state lawmakers over the wildfire response and the lack of water and fire hydrants in L.A. A federal judge is barring the founder of the far-right Oath Keepers extremist group from entering Washington, D.C. Stewart Rhodes was also prohibited from entering the U.S. Capitol without the court's approval. NPR's Rian Lucas has more.
Oath Keepers founder and leader Stewart Rhodes was convicted by a federal jury of seditious conspiracy in connection with the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021 by a mob of Trump supporters. U.S. District Judge Amit Mehta sentenced Rhodes to 18 years in prison and called him an ongoing threat to the country. On Monday, after taking office again, President Trump commuted Rhodes' sentence to time served, and since his release from prison, Rhodes was spotted at the U.S. Capitol. Now, Judge Mehta has issued an order prohibiting Rhodes and 7 other Oath Keepers convicted in connection with the Capitol riot from entering Washington, D.C. or the U.S. Capitol building or grounds without first obtaining the court's permission. Rian Lucas, NPR News, Washington.
Minnesota state politics are in turmoil as both Republicans and Democrats say they should control the state house while a legal challenge plays out. Minnesota Public Radio's Dana Ferguson has more.
Republicans and Democrats came out of the November election in a tie, but Democrats have since lost a seat to a residency challenge. Republicans argue that they have a majority and should be able to use it. Democrats have boycotted to stop legislative sessions. The Minnesota Supreme Court heard arguments yesterday in a pair of challenges from House Democrats and the Secretary of State. Chief Justice Natalie Hudson said the court faces a difficult situation.
What we have is a co-equal branch of government that is completely dysfunctional.
The court could agree to strike the current power structure, let it stand, or go another direction. For NPR News, I'm Dana Ferguson in St. Paul.
You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
This is KUOW News. I'm Paige Browning in Seattle. A bipartisan group of lawmakers wants Washington state to own up to its climate pollution more quickly. State senators today are considering a measure to require faster disclosure of Washington's global climate impacts. KUOW's John Rian reports.
State officials have long proclaimed that Washington is a leader in tackling climate change. The truth of those claims is hard to judge since the state reveals how much pollution it pumps out years after the fact. State law currently requires carbon dioxide emissions to be tallied and disclosed every 2 years. A bill before the Senate Environment Committee this morning would make the state disclose its pollution annually. The Ecology Department currently takes up to 4 years to reveal results of the state's efforts to curb emissions. The conservative Washington Policy Center sued the state this week to get it to reveal its climate-harming pollution as fast as state law currently requires. John Ryan, KUOW News.
Washington State's Attorney General is pushing back on a Trump administration plan that targets government officials who refuse to enforce immigration crackdowns. Attorney General Nick Brown issued a statement with attorneys from 12 other states. They say the Constitution prevents the federal government from, quote, commandeering states to enforce federal laws. They were responding to a Justice Department memo warning that state and local officials could face criminal charges. Washington state and cities like Seattle have laws preventing law enforcement from asking about immigration status or assisting with non-criminal immigration enforcement. Sound Transit's moving to speed up improvements to its system aimed at making light rail more reliable. This comes after CEO Gorman Sparman declared an emergency this week, citing reliability and stability issues. King 5 reports about 6% of light rail service was disrupted during the first 11 months of 2024. This is KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Fisher Investments. Fisher's dedicated team of specialists provide resources on investing, retirement income, estate planning, and more. Learn more at FisherInvestments.com. Investing in securities involves the risk of loss.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. It's week one of the Trump administration. Week one of Ichiro's Hall of Fame residency. David tells me there's some connection that might emerge.
That's right, there is.
We'll see. We'll see. David Boze there, Washington Policy Center Communications Director. He's on my panel. You know, I bring a panel together every week and we figure out what happened this week, what it means. I'd also like to welcome Rian Watt, Executive Director of the Economic Opportunity Institute. Hi, Ryan.
Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. And Josh Farley, Seattle Times opinion columnist and editorial board member. Good to see you here.
Thanks so much for having me, Bill. First time in studio. A pleasure to be with you.
I know you used to do it remotely and come from. Were you coming from Bremerton today on the?
That's
State
right.
Ferry?
Yeah.
All right. Well, good because we're going to talk about state ferries.
I hope we do.
I want to know about your experience. All of this is watchable, by the way. You can go to YouTube and search KUOW, and you can view the show. Okay, let's get into the news of this week. It took a day for our state's new attorney general to sue the Trump administration, and it worked. Our Constitution says, U.S. Constitution says, if you're born here, you are an American citizen. On Inauguration Day, President Trump issued an executive order to end birthright citizenship. Washington's Attorney General Nick Brown and some other states said you can't do that.
That's thousands of people born here in Washington who would be denied the key to full participation and opportunity in American society.
So those states sued, and yesterday a Seattle federal judge called the executive order unconstitutional, un-American, and cruel, and he temporarily blocked it. This is a federal judge, John KUOW, who was appointed by Republican President Ronald Reagan, and he was scathing. Any surprise in the room?
Well, I'm just going to make the connection to baseball right now.
Okay.
Ichiro made home runs look easy, and the Trump administration's executive order made a home run look easy for Nick Brown because, this was one of those slow pitch, easy, right down the middle.
Right.
The Constitution's pretty clear on this. It's kind of a novel legal challenge to, I think it's like an 1895 decision or something where they're trying to argue about whether or not these individuals are subject to the laws of the United States. But it's one of those things where sometimes people want conservatives generally are critical of people who want to wish language to mean something that it doesn't, and especially when it comes to the constitutional language, and they'll say that's a progressive habit. They reinterpret the living document, which nobody would put up with in a labor contract or anything else. It means what it says it means. And this is one of those cases where the challenge trying to create this new legal argument is highly unlikely to go anywhere, especially for people who go for original intent.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's meaningful that it took this Reagan-appointed judge only 25 minutes to declare this blatantly unconstitutional. I'm not an attorney, but I assume that's a pretty good record for the AG. I think the broader point here, though, is that it clearly doesn't matter to Trump whether what he's proposing is constitutional or not. He's pushing the limits here, and he's trying to see how far he can go, and he's going to go as far as the rest of society will let him get away with.
Or the courts.
Or the courts. Exactly. And in this case, the courts are pushing back.
Right. Yeah. I am experiencing some deja vu here. It was how many years ago now? 8, I suppose, that Bob Ferguson was initially, I think, the first lawsuit out of the first Trump years was the bans from Muslim majority countries. And here we are again. I would push back a little bit, David, just to say, it's still a relatively small number of states that have filed this lawsuit, and that good on Nick Brown out of the gates. He said this during his campaign, and he's following through with being a very meaningful and important check on the powers of the president.
How are you pushing back? What do you mean?
Well, I don't think, I don't think it's like a softball home run. We've seen some pretty crazy decisions in the last few years out of the Supreme Court. Some things that Trump is doing already. A big majority of our members of Congress voted to have ByteDance divest TikTok. And yet he has taken federal legislation, however you feel about that, and said, we're going to hit the pause button for a little while on this.
Supreme Court upheld it.
So
and he still ignored it.
Exactly. Yeah. So I agree with what Rian is saying. I think we're seeing a testing of some limits here, but we need those attorney generals and particularly in this case to step up.
I think you see that with others too, like with Biden on what was it on forgiving student loans and other things. He was upset by the court, said, "Well, I'm going to ignore the court." And so you have presidents. Trump tends to do it with a megaphone. And, with shouting from the rooftops. Others do it with more social graces. But this has been a habit of presidents testing the limits to see what they can get away with based on what policies that they want to achieve for some time.
Certainly every president tests the limits to some extent, but I don't think this is a matter of distinction being social graces or not. I think clearly this administration and this president believes that he and those he perceives to be on his team, whether they are or not, should be above the law, and everyone else should have the full force of the law applied to them and come down on them with incredible force. And, I know it's not stylish to be sincere about belief in civic principles, but I really think that everyone should be treated equally under the law. And it's clear to me from this first week that the president doesn't believe that at the moment.
I have a question for you from a listener. Pete writes in, and Pete says he's a Democratic precinct official, has never voted for a Republican. He says a big reason Trump is president is that Democrats are out of line here with public opinion on illegal immigration. So even if it sounds like everyone's agreeing Trump's executive order is blatantly unconstitutional, violates the 14th Amendment, Pete wants to know why not change the amendment to attach citizenship rights to legal immigration. And I'll quote Pete, who says, the policy could state that it's not retroactive or that it doesn't apply to current migrants under some circumstances. It could contain exceptions and provisions to ensure fairness, but it might help to diffuse the political backlash to excessive immigration that has resulted in an extreme right-wing takeover in the U.S.
I
Two
think
things.
birthright citizenship is entirely separate from a conversation about illegal immigration and how much or how little of that we should have in this country.
Well, it is seen as an incentive for people to come to the United States.
It's settled law and it's constitutional law.
Yeah, that's not the question. It's blatantly unconstitutional. Sounds like everyone's agreeing. Pete's question is why Nick Brown I think he's suggesting that Washington State and our Attorney General can pat themselves on the back, but that they're doing something that has gotten us the Trump presidency.
Well, I think there were some polls indicating that the Democrat Party was out of touch to a certain extent on immigration issues, specifically illegal immigration issues, and of course. The other thing is just because one party is out of touch doesn't mean that the other party is, sometimes they take a rejection of one party and think that means it's an endorsement of everything the other people are doing. And usually it's some kind of mix of the two. But this issue isn't about, it's true there's an incentive problem. I mean, there was recently a prosecution of somebody running a tourism, birth tourism visa thing, and that's happened a number of times. So there's an incentive issue to discuss, but the reason why it wasn't done that way is because constitutional amendments are hard, and it's a lot easier if you're a policymaker, if you can convince judges to reinterpret law or the Constitution to get what you want, and that's why this approach is taken first. It's great to have that conversation. They could open up that conversation. The executive order currently, it actually does not go retroactive. It says after this would take effect, some kind of nonsense. But anyway, It's the kind of thing where it's just a hard conversation. It's really hard to get a constitutional amendment. That's why they're not doing it that way.
Okay. Did I interrupt you though, Ryan?
No, it's your show, Bill. It's your show.
That's what they want.
What I'll say is that, I think a kernel of truth in what this caller says is that it's not going to be enough, I believe, looking from the outside in, for Democrats to simply say stop or resist to everything the Trump administration does. They need to put forward a positive vision for what they want to see in this state. And, I think they have an opportunity to do that. I think our GDP in this state last year was $850 billion, which if it was an own independent country would be somewhere in the top 25 in the world. I am not suggesting we become an independent country here in Washington at all. But I am saying that we have a bigger GDP than Denmark or Norway. We can build the kind of society that invests in people right here in Washington. We can lower costs on housing, lower costs on childcare, lower costs for working families. And I think that really is what people in this state are saying, that costs are too high.
Let me move to another Attorney General move. Again, Washington's Nick Brown pushing back on a Trump plan to target sanctuary states and cities. Washington and Seattle have laws that say police and sheriffs cannot ask about immigration status, cannot help with non-criminal immigration enforcement. This week, the Trump Justice Department warned that state and local officials could face criminal charges for impeding immigration enforcement. In response, Nick Brown and 12 other attorneys general issued a statement saying that the Constitution prevents the federal government from, quote, commandeering states to enforce federal laws. Dave, what about that one? Any problem with that statement?
Well, I really like the idea that whenever Trump's in office, people love federalism again. So, I agree with that notion that state officers are not to be, they can't be told what to do by the federal government when it comes to their own proper sphere of influences. That's an appropriate constitutional check and balance part of our system. And I think, oftentimes people people have this idea of centralizing, and they look to it's. I don't know if it's a function of our perception on TV or movies where solutions are solved by feds coming in, and there's that hilarious rock movie about the San Andreas earthquake thing, and by the time the tsunami hits and recedes, the federal government's helicopters are already there rescuing people. There's this perception that there's this instant thing. It doesn't work that way. So having these checks and balances are super important. And I think, a pushback in that regard, it's different if they're trying to interfere with the feds doing federal business, but you can't just tell the state what to do.
Yeah, I agree. This is one where, the arguments get really confused between the principled arguments and the substance of what's talking about. It's it's pretty difficult to disentangle. But I think our state leaders have an obligation to do what they think will protect people who live in this state, and I'm sure that's exactly what they'll do.
Yeah, local law enforcement's not accountable to federal government. Period. Full stop.
And there might be some wiggle room in here. You know, some Washington state sheriffs are saying that they will gladly cooperate with federal immigration officers. Here is Bob Songer, sheriff of Klickitat County by the central Oregon border.
I don't care if this is a blue state, a sanctuary state, but this sheriff is not going to refuse to help ICE. We will be there to help ICE to do the job.
Now, depending what actions he takes, Sheriff Songer could violate that state law that I referred to. His deputies cannot ask about immigration status. They can work with immigration officials, for example, if somebody ends up in a state prison, or to take down human and drug trafficking rings. So there could be legal gray areas here between what is assisting federal immigration enforcement and what is impeding it. So I'm curious what you all think within those voluntary gray areas of action. Where would you like to see local law enforcement lean?
I would think those were the kind of gray areas you'd want to help the federal government on. If you've got drug dealers, traffickers, MS-13 gang affiliations and members running around, those are the people that in Washington state they might find some common ground.
I mean, I think the word, if you have those people, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. I certainly agree that, like, where there's organized crime, we should try to stop organized crime. And I think that it is irresponsible to conflate organized crime with this question of immigration. There's a lot of people in this state who are coming here to work, to contribute to the state, who pay taxes in this state. And I think that there's been a pretty significant, pretty organized effort to connect that idea to the idea that we're not taking on organized crime in a serious way. I want to take on organized crime. I want to stop drug trafficking in this state. Those are all important things to take on. And it's really important, I think, to hold that separate from the conversation about the kind of society we are and what we mean when we welcome immigrants.
Yeah,
Right.
preach, you guys. I'm on board. I agree wholeheartedly.
Well put. Okay. The Seattle Times, I saw, reported on a small poll, a survey of about 400 registered Washington voters, asking whether Washington state should cooperate with Trump on deporting undocumented people. I was surprised that 51%, and this is weighted, more people from the Puget Sound area than other places, all that stuff. This is an Elway poll, they know what they're doing, but it's 400 people. But I was surprised 51 people said the state should cooperate. Only 40% said Washington should resist. And even in King County, it was more people saying cooperate than resist, than plenty, like 10% people had no opinion. But I'm curious, any reaction as to, well, I guess we're getting back to what is in line with our own Washington state public opinion now.
I think it's clear. I mean, immigration has been a festering problem in the United States since the last meaningful reform was during the Reagan years, like 86 or something. It's a serious problem. Did Democrats let it fester under Biden's administration? Okay, sure. Did they also, help advance an effort that a Democrat from Connecticut, an independent senator from Arizona, and a conservative Republican from Oklahoma, they put together legislation, and we remember this, right? I hope no one has amnesia, but like in the early part of 2024, there was legislation that would have overhauled how we do immigration and would have produced a closure of the border when a certain number of people were coming over, asylum system, et cetera. And Trump made it very clear, no, don't you touch this until I'm back in the White House, right? So it's not as if they didn't propose a solution. There was something on the table.
If I remember correctly, there were some devils in the details that other people didn't like on that score. I can't remember now. It's been too long. I'm lucky to remember yesterday. But, politics is just a weird game, and it's kind of sad when it comes to this issue because, it's just one of those things where decade after decade, same debates, same thing. And it has been made demonstrably larger, I think, over the course of the Biden administration's, lackadaisical approach to the border. But, it's tough because there are political games. Like, you don't want, the debate about immigration to be conflated with crime. And yet, on one side, if somebody brings up something, they'll automatically say you're conflating that thing. And then the other side gets on. So I feel like there's a lot of just human beings trying to live their lives and live in a better country that get kind of run over by the politics of both the left and the right. I had a friend who tried for 17 years to get a green card in Washington State, and his daughter was born here, and and there was a mistake at the hospital, so she was permanently disabled, severely. And finally gave up and went back to to get a citizenship in Europe, and that was relatively quickly. But this is somebody who was creating jobs and all the rest, and he could have gotten a special dispensation, but he said, "I'm not special. I don't want that. I just want the normal." And he spent $35,000 back when $35,000 meant something. And
well, it means something now.
Yeah, but not as much. And he said, I don't want to be dishonest. If I'm going to be an American, I want to be an American. Then, now he's a European, lives in Italy, does great. But it's just a sad thing. I think every time this debate comes up, I just feel bad about it because I'm very skeptical about anything real happening.
Here is another local version of a reaction to the new administration this week. Another Trump executive order tells federal agencies to end DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and identify publicly traded companies or other entities for civil investigations into allegedly illegal DEI practices. Now, lots of companies have backed away from DEI, including Boeing, but this week, Costco shareholders pushed back. They overwhelmingly rejected a shareholder proposal that called DEI illegal, immoral, and detrimental to shareholder value. The chair of the Costco board, Tony James, urged shareholders to vote no.
We owe our success to the more than 300,000 employees who serve our members every day. It is important that they all feel included and appreciated, and that they transmit these values to our customers.
James said that in preliminary polling, more than 98% of shares voted against the proposal. David, Costco shares are up 200% in the last 5 years. How much more wokeness damage can that company take?
Well, yeah, it's tough for them.
It's too much success.
They still haven't brought back the Polish hot dogs. So until they do that, they're on my list. But that said, this is one of those things where the words, how people use the words and the tone they use the words can convey two different meanings. DEI, if you're talking about kind of a radical use discrimination, to fight discrimination, is the kind of thing that I think most Americans don't like. But if you're talking about DEI as far as making people feel welcome, include people, I think that's the kind of thing that most people do like. So, for a lot of people, it all depends on language, the tone of language, and the meaning of language.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a situation where there's been an effort to make DEI mean whatever it needs to mean for the political moment, and that's a shame for legitimate efforts to make workplaces feel like good places where lots of people can contribute and work. I mean, I think the beautiful thing about our market system is that companies can make their own decisions about what's going to be helpful for their business. It sounds like Costco shareholders are completely aligned that this is going to be good for their business. If they feel that way, if they feel it's valuable, I think they should be able to do it, and I don't think the president should have anything to say about it.
Yeah, and I would just, along the same lines, echo that it reminds me of I didn't leave the party left me. We saw in 2020 during the racial, justice protests after George Floyd's death, Costco's CEO came out and made a very clear, concrete statement. It might not have, been sort of bumper stickerish or bandwagon jumping. It was just, we don't tolerate this kind of thing. We believe in equity, equality. We want a diverse workforce that represents America at Costco, and those are our values, and they're continuing. I think they're being consistent.
Yeah, and I think again, this whole issue isn't really about DEI. It's about Trump pushing the boundaries and seeing how much he can get away with. I don't know every provision in that executive order, but my understanding is there are also provisions around federal contracting and changing the way that happens to make it easier for Trump to award contracts to friends and donors. And I mean, I would like to live in a world where federal contracting goes through a fair process and that it's illegal to discriminate basis on race, gender, class, any number of things in the workplace. And it is illegal to do those things now, and I think it should stay that way.
Well, it's a classical federal dollars thing. There's always strings attached, I mean, that's been a problem that conservatives had for a long time, is when federal dollars are given, then the feds want to control part of your policy too. It's like getting money from your parents, as long as you're getting money from your parents, they can have a say in your life. And that's part of the challenge.
My house, my rules.
Yeah,
David.
I mean, the executive order seems to attack the discriminatory possibilities within some of these programs, and that makes sense. That's more on the federal side of things. But as you point out, it's a free country. Companies can do what they want to do. Costco's doing what they want to do. There's plenty of people that'll be excited about that, and even more people that are going to divorce themselves from politics and be excited about $1.50 hot dogs and cheap and wonderful service. But the interesting thing is Costco treats their employees really well. And I've had many friends work for Costco. They all like Costco. And demographically speaking, and I was a Gen Xer, and I thought a lot of these racial problems would be gone by the time I was, an older guy. Obviously, that's not the case. But demographically speaking, the country is becoming far more diverse, far more blended, far more. So, over time, a lot of this stuff is going to take care of itself. Thank goodness.
I will say on the Costco employees and how they feel about Costco front, I don't work there. I don't know people who work there, so I don't know any of this firsthand. But I do know there's a unionization effort underway. So at least some of the workers at Costco have some improvements in mind.
And I would just say, I'm not sure if I entirely agree with the idea that this is just about federal dollars attached. Of all the moments that were really, let's say, jarring from Monday's inauguration, I think one of the lasting images that we'll be seeing for years is, a bunch of tech CEOs sitting even in front of potential cabinet members. I think we have entered. I think there's. You correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm a big fan of learning about the history of the Gilded Age and technological progress during that time. I think in some ways we're living through a second one, and it's very clear to me that in the artificial intelligence, the AI arms race, we're seeing an encircling of. Joe Biden used the term oligarchs. We're seeing some of this emerge, and I think it's more than just about federal dollars. It's about there's a relationship that's formed between the most elite CEOs in America and the President of the United States that we I think is something we haven't seen before. And
you're sounding very populist right now.
I think it's a fair point, and it's a failure on both parties. I think, because I completely agree with what you're saying, that these tech leaders and leaders across the business community at the very highest levels have aligned themselves with this administration, and so I think if Republican voters look at that seriously, they'll see that this is an administration of elites. But Democratic voters, I think, also view their party as insufficiently combative with powerful elites. We know the economy works better for the rich and powerful than it does for everyone else. And I don't think folks are seeing the Democratic Party really taking on that issue in any serious way either.
There's a lot of things to tackle there, but I'm just going to focus on one, which is both. There's plenty of people that, especially the super rich, actually tend to be on the left, including many of the tech people. But
a lot of them are switching. The Mark Andreessens of the world and the Jeff Bezoses of the world.
That's what I'm getting to. They're not switching, but they recognize the federal government has power, and one of the things that people tend to want is more centralized power. That when they think of solutions, they think, let's get a federal solution. I don't like what Florida's doing. Let's make sure we get this. We need the one size fits all because it's easier to track, and there's lots of reasons for it. But the more authority that you give the federal government over how people live their lives, how they do their business, what business can be done, what it looks like, all the rules that are possible within the federal purview, the more money you're going to attract, because those people are going to want a seat at the table. And even if the regulations impact them, they'll make sure that their competitors, are shut out. That's, you just, as if you have your thumb on the rules, then you can make it so that the rules, even if they're limiting what you can do, they further limit your competitors or whatever else. So as long as we keep giving more and more authority, to government, then there's going to be more money attracted to it, I think.
Let's talk. Here's another way that Washington State goes against the Trump grain is climate policy. Trump is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, allowing more offshore drilling, stopping new wind power projects on federal lands, et cetera, et cetera. Washington State, as we know, has been doing the opposite. Josh, what does the Trump administration mean for Washington State climate policy?
I think that's really interesting. I honestly think that particularly voters upholding the Climate Commitment Act, which of course creates the cap and trade system we have in Washington State and uses the revenues to do other things to hopefully reduce carbon emissions.
This is our state requiring the big polluters to
Right.
buy allowances for emissions and then over time ratchet down how much they can emit.
Exactly right, and that's going to stick around. And voters said that should stick around by large margins. And so I think it serves as a kind of bulwark against what the federal government does. But to me, I'm very curious to see sort of Trump's impulses on this. So he's come out and said he does not like wind power, even though it's roughly 10% of America's power grid today. He talks about this idea that we are in an emergent state. There's a state of emergency on
an energy emergency.
Yeah, at a time when we are drilling more oil, natural gas than any country in the history of the planet.
He's saying that artificial intelligence is going to suck up even more than we were planning on expending, more energy.
Sure, but I think what remains to be seen is that so the Biden administration also pumped more into clean energy through, not only the infrastructure bill that was passed, but also the Inflation Reduction Act. There's billions of dollars at stake. There's companies waiting to do projects to decarbonize our economy. And what we don't know is that, again, even if he wants to stand up those data centers that are so important for the future of artificial intelligence, they need electrons. They need power on the grid, and it doesn't really matter where it comes from. It shouldn't matter, I would think, in his mind. So it's curious that he picked Texas for this announcement for the I think they're calling it the Stargate project, $500 billion. They picked
for AI.
For AI, Texas has its own ERCOT. They have their own power grid there. They're not, we have the Western interconnection out this way and the Pacific Northwest grid. But I'll use one last example there. So Bonneville Power Administration is sitting on, I think, $4 billion for increasing transmission. Transmission is critical if we're going to capitalize in terms of clean energy economy and writ large, just reliability of the grid, the wind that's in the Midwest that's pervasive, as well as the sun in the Southwest. We need to be able to move that power long distances, and that's important for data center development and AI development as well. Does that? So I'm just really curious to see sort of will he fall to the whims of his sort of dislike of wind power, or will he recognize that it is also important if economically, and what I think we view as very important environmentally as well.
Yeah, my sense is that the ball is already rolling on the economics of a clean energy transition. Like, it's already clear to big business and to the major power suppliers that this is going to be the way that's financially sustainable in the future, putting aside the environmental implications entirely for the moment. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that some of that energy transition stuff will happen, but we are seeing the effects of climate change already, very viscerally in LA, obviously, over the last couple of weeks. But, there was like 1.5 inches of snow on the ground in Florida last week, something like that, which obviously is not an emergency in quite the same way as the LA fires, but is still representative of a changing system. And we were talking a little bit before the show about there's a way in which the federal government has always served as sort of a national insurance provider for climate emergencies and for emergencies writ large, and Trump clearly is interested in changing that with today's news about FEMA.
It's strange to me how, like in Washington State, there's a lot of people that will pay a premium for being green. Same in Portland, or two of the top states in that for across the nation, as far as being willing to pay more for things if you feel environmentally respectful. But you look at Washington State's climate policy. Governor Inslee ran for president. He was called a leader in climate policy. We're often called a leader in climate policy, and our climate policies have failed. And over the past 12 years, emissions went up. They went up after COVID. That's an entire economic shutdown. And so
would they have gone up more without these policies?
And how much money went into the policies? There's a lot of opportunity cost what ifs, but people don't look at that, and they're not. And the officials aren't being held to account for failure of policies because they just announce a new dramatic program and they get credit for the headline. That's the political credit and the credit for feeling like they're leading on something. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they've actually accomplished something. The Trump administration's priority is obviously it's energy. They want prosperity because prosperity requires energy. So that's where all their focus is going to be. But there's lots of reasons for that. Because prosperity isn't just about money. It's about people having time with their kids, doing what they want to do, living better lives, living in the American dream, and all that. But setting aside the feds for a moment, the Washington state, I would take issue that the Climate Commitment Act was even though the vote was pretty lopsided, this was the first time that we had language on the ballot that I thought was ridiculous and biased, with the whole financial impact language inserted into the ballot itself, talking about. So it switches the question from the tax that you're actually talking about to what it is that it pays for, knowing that all funds are fungible. The legislature decides what's going to fund what. But the way we've shifted the ballot language, it makes it seem as though as long as you put a certain amount of your funding into medical research for children, or some kind of thing that people really support, education, then you're always going to have this thing that says, are you in favor of taking away the funding for this thing that we really prioritize, instead of having
I think that
people
actually frames the
prioritize?
question accurately. I mean, I think that what we saw on the ballot was an accurate description of what would have happened if the CCA had been repealed, and voters reacted to that.
We've
and
had
decided they wanted
billions
to
of
do it.
extra revenue in this state, and you're saying that
And I
of
and I
course,
also
but
think-
wait, that's your view, and that means your view was put into there's
The
always
ballot
there's
language
always
is
at
reviewed by a
least two sides.
nonpartisan group that just describes
All I'm telling you
what the
is
ballot
that-
would do. Previously, exactly as you said, it would typically only describe costs. And of course, if you describe something to someone as only the cost, like, do I want to lose $10? No, but do I want to trade $10 for a hamburger for lunch? Yes. I mean, like, this is a very normal way to talk about trade-offs, and voters
And
were able
that's
to react to that
appropriate in the
trade-offs.
debate about what the actual thing would do. But when the question is, if you cut this, then this happens, that's not the truth, because people that are elected decide where money goes.
Of course they
And
do,
that's-
and I think voters are sophisticated enough to understand that. But they also understand that there's a specific piece of legislation that had specific investments tied to specific policy goals. And the question in front of them was, should we keep these? And the voters said yes.
Even the specific
Listen,
policy goals.
now we're talking about the ballot measure.
No,
that
it's
was
the
voted
principle,
on
because
several months
it's
ago.
but it's going to keep going, because now this is every time that there's a question, there's going to be this new language coming up that says, well, this could, and that's why I said all you have to do is whatever you come up with, you make sure some of that funding goes to something that's publicly popular.
Josh, you
that's
have
it.
the last word. I was
Well,
asking you about
I
climate
think,
policy.
yeah, let's come back to Trump, and let's come back to something that is a milestone in our climate policy in Washington, which is that the Clean Energy Transformation Act at the end, December 31st, 2025, is the last day that coal can not only be emitted as a power energy source in the state of Washington, but also every utility in the state cannot have coal within their retail portfolio for the purposes of generation. We're getting rid of coal in Washington at the end of this year. That's a pretty substantial, I think, step forward from a dirtier energy source. It will be backfilled by natural gas. You could argue that, again, even incremental improvements are important, and I would just note that in my mind is a milestone.
We must take a break.
Concept of
the
that,
the
yeah.
natural gas powered clock tells me we've got to take a break and come right back with more Week in Review. I don't know that we're going to say the word Trump again for the rest of this hour. We'll see. We have other things to talk about. Stay tuned.
Support for KUOW comes from Purpose Dignity Action. Working with partners in human services, law enforcement, and local government, PDA designs and implements solutions to help neighborhood public safety challenges, offering stabilization and recovery for people with complex needs. Learn more or donate at wearepda.org. And from Eco Design and Maintenance, family-owned and specializing in start-to-finish exterior design using materials and methods that help to reduce environmental impact. From landscapes to hardscaping, outdoor spaces designed to be functional and long-lasting. More at eco-seattle.com.
KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham.
Hi, I'm NPR's Rachel Martin. Join me for a special taping of my podcast Wildcard, live in Seattle. That's March 13th at Town Hall, Seattle. Get your tickets at kuow.org/events.
KUOW live events sponsored by Finney Ridge Painting and BECU.
KUOW's Week in Review. You can't quiet us, even if the microphones are not on. We're always talking. We're helping you work through the news of the week. We did a lot of Trump consideration the first part of the show. We've got more to say about this week gone by, and I, Bill Radke, am here with the Seattle Times' Josh Farley, with Economic Opportunity Institute's Ryan Watt, and Washington Policy Center's David Boze. And the thing that you all, I think unanimously, really wanted to talk about this week was Ichiro Suzuki, who got voted into the Hall of Fame on the first ballot. First ballot means you've got to wait like 5 years after you play before you're eligible. You're on the first ballot. Lots of people don't get into the Hall of Fame on the very first ballot. It just comes up year after year. But Ichiro, almost a unanimous vote, 393 out of 394 votes for Suzuki in the Hall of Fame. Why did you all care so much? We don't need the Hall of Fame telling us he was a great player. We saw it with our own eyes. Why does this matter?
Well, look, as I think the only person in the room who used to be a member of the Baseball Writers Association of America had a card for
and
5
that's
years.
Who votes for the
That's
Hall
who
of Fame
votes. After you've had the card for 10 years, you're eligible to vote.
Yeah.
Be one of those 399. I gave up my card when I stopped covering the Mariners. Look, I mean, Ichiro didn't need the writers to tell him he was a Hall of Famer,
Right.
and he was one of the transcendent players of the last generation. He was going to be a Hall of Famer no matter what the voters said. And obviously, this one guy would like nothing more than for us to spend all of our time talking about why he thought that Ichiro wasn't a Hall of Famer. Maybe he had 10 other guys he was trying to vote for. I don't know what his story was. But this is a great moment to celebrate a great player, legend in Seattle, legend in the game, legend around the world, like a guy who really opened up Major League Baseball to fans in Japan in a way that hadn't existed. And, we see that legacy today with Shohei Ohtani and so many other players.
Couldn't have said it better. It's just the guy that made you smile every time you watched him play, because the guy loved the game, and you could tell his fans from around the world loved coming here, brought Seattle attention, and kind of when I see Ichiro, just harkens back to a wonderful time for the city when we really were the Emerald City, and showing all that optimism and potential. Just one nod to the writer, though. I have to say, I pictured him thinking, the only way that everyone's going to vote here, but I can be an asterisk in history, baseball history now, if I just do this one thing.
But the writer's not public, as far as I know.
Yeah, but he'll know it's him.
He'll know it's him.
It's me
or her. Yes,
right.
Josh.
Oh, I'm honestly, is there onions in here? Because I'm getting a little teary-eyed just thinking about Ichiro. I remember watching him his very first season in 2001, and the unique baseball player that he was. I just remember when pitchers hadn't figured him out, and he could literally, it's like a pinball machine. He could literally go like 3 or 4 for 5 in a game and hit, singles, doubles, triples up the line one way, then down the middle. It was like,
for those listeners who are not that into baseball, truly, Suzuki was my favorite baseball player of all time,
bar none.
And just one little aspect that you're getting at. Some people called him a slap hitter. Mm-hmm. He had an unusual style of hitting, and then on top, and accuracies to spray the ball around, and that he was also super fast
and had a cannon
of an arm. Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to, for those who, I don't want to lose listeners who don't really understand, but he was truly a gift to.
I'm not even a baseball fan, and everything you said is so true.
And
it's great.
Yeah, he was amazing. He could do whatever he wanted on the baseball field. Like you said, he had this reputation from people who didn't watch him maybe closely that he didn't have a lot of power. He could hit for power if he wanted to. There was one week some commentator had gotten on him for he never hits for power, and so he hit like 3 home runs in like 2 games or something. He was like, well, I'm not trying to do that every time.
I personally am going to label that a myth. You're the baseball writer, and I'm not, and yet I'm skeptical, which is part of the fun. This is part of the fun. Sports used to be fun. And one of the fun things is the mythic, the color, the lore, that kind of thing. The idea that Ichiro could have hit a home run anytime he wanted to is so silly because, there's he never played in a single World Series. He did not get the Mariners to a World Series one time. He hit 117 homers. That's not very many compared to a lot of baseball hitters. I could imagine a reason that this writer, I have no idea why, but I could imagine that's part of the fun, is that it's not unanimous. Some it's like a barstool debate you would have. Some curmudgeon refused to let him in.
Yeah. Ken Griffey missed by unanimity by 3 votes. Joe DiMaggio was a 3rd ballot Hall of Famer, which just goes to show you the writers have been getting it wrong for a long time.
Right. I gotta say, I'll be the dissent here when you're talking about how celebratory this week's news was. As I said, we already knew he's a Hall of Famer. We watched him. My reaction when he was in the Hall, got voted in, was, of course, I'm happy for him. I'm happy for anybody who's in the Hall of Fame. That must be great. But then it was, oh yeah, the Mariners have wasted so much talent never getting to the World Series. Between Suzuki and Griffey and Randy Johnson and
Edgar.
Felix and Edgar Martinez, that was I must be a sad sack, but that was my reaction.
You're supposed to be a proper fan and just think, the Mariners, maybe next year.
Right.
That's what you do.
You're the baseball, right? I should give you the last word.
I grew up a Cubs fan, and then I was lucky enough to be there for the World Series in 2016. Covered those games in person. That was a really
lucky.
Wow. It was a really special moment, and I was still training myself to not applaud in the press box.
Right. No cheering in the press box.
Can't do that. But all I'll say about it is I can't wait for when the Mariners finally win a series. You see this town light up when they get good, when there's even a chance, like over the course of the summer. Like it was such a special thing to be in Chicago when that happened, and it's going to be so special to be in Seattle when they finally do it.
Agreed. No disagreement there. Okay, before we take another break, because our new president drove us to be a little behind on this hour of considering the news, as I mentioned at the top, it's great to have you in here in the studio for a change, Josh. You live in Bremerton. You took a ferry boat, which
sure did.
The ferries have been such a mess. I've got friends on Vashon who just consider it a cruel, cruel joke of a ferry system. And you wrote in the Seattle Times about how our ferries could fix themselves, and it included delaying. We're back to climate. You recommend delaying that switch to electric boats.
Sort of. So there's a nuance there. So right now,
I hate nuance.
I know it's the worst, and we don't have enough time to go into all the nitty-gritty particulars. But the state right now, through previous Governor Inslee and the legislature, is on track. We were hoping that we were going to get a ton of bids nationwide. The legislature said, you know what, we can't bid just in Washington. We've only really got one shipyard or a couple of shipyards that could do that work. So nationwide shipbuilding increases competition. Great. Well, we've got 3 shipyards right now around the country, Philadelphia, Florida, and then one here in Washington. And they're going to have to build this new class of vessel. And we're hoping to get 5 vessels. They're going to cost upwards of $260 million plus a piece. And we don't get the bids back until probably when the legislature is out of session this year, after their 105-day session this year. So there's risks involved. This is still a big project, but I'm hopeful. I think many of us who commute by ferry, I think that people in Washington that want to see this fleet revitalized, not only for themselves, but as I mentioned in my column, it's an icon of our state. We want to see it
I have a
thriving.
Washington State Ferry Christmas ornament, Josh.
There you go.
Yes.
I have several on my tree as well, so I'm with you there, Bill. But so I mean, we're all kind of hoping that the bids come back favorably. We can build these boats, electrify the terminals, and that this works. However, there's risks involved to that. The risk that I don't think is worth taking at this point is going into the existing fleet, which is already antiquated. There's a boat that is still in service from the Eisenhower administration. It was built literally in 1959. Our boats are old. They have tons of backlog.
The Tacoma?
The Tacoma is actually is part of the class, the Jumbo Mark II class. It's actually the most reliable boats in the whole system. They took one of those, the Wenatchee, that's sitting over at Vigor right now, and they're trying to make it into a hybrid. I think you got to leave the old boats alone. You've got to let them We got to get by with them. We've got World Cup coming up next year in Seattle. Tons of people are going to be taking the ferries. We just got the numbers back. 21 million people rode not just Washington State ferries, but King County Water Taxi, Kitsap Transit, and it's fast, which I took the fast ferry this morning from Bremerton. We've got to hold it together until we can get some new boats. And again, there's risks with the new hybrid electrics. Let's keep our fingers crossed, but also let's not do anything to the existing fleet. Let's do everything we can to hold it together until we start to get new boats. You can't go down to your local used car dealership and get a roll-on, roll-off, a double-ended ferry. They just don't exist.
Okay, your entire column is at the Seattle Times, Josh Farley.
Thank you.
I want to do what the state ferry system cannot, which is to stay on time. I don't want this show to be down to one boat. Any quick reaction to that, or did we cover
We should
it?
absolutely delay the electric ferries. It's too expensive. The first Vigor estimate was $400 million for a ferry, 60% over the original estimate from Washington State Ferries. The impact on climate is absolutely negligible. It's not really a part of the debate when we're talking about the Washington State ferry system. The ferry, we're years delayed already because we went down the road for a different build design, and the ferry system's been a mess. And we have to realize that the State Department of Transportation keeps saying we're $1.3 or $4 billion per year behind just in maintenance costs right now. So it's not really a question of what we wish we had. Electric ferries be nice and cool and great, but we don't have that kind of money. I mean,
setting aside
it's not
the
realistic.
actual vessels, I think there's also a personnel and operator issue here. I mean, these are very skilled jobs. There are jobs that you can be hired into the private sector for as well, and WashDOT has a hard time competing, I think, for really, really skilled workers. And so I think we need to find a way to raise pay for these workers so that they can attract and retain really, really talented people.
Yes, Josh.
Oh, I could go all day with
And
it.
we're doing it right now with overtime because there's not enough of them, and part of that was the firing of people for the COVID thing, which was absurd. But
speaking of overtime, I commend you to the Seattle Times and Josh Farley's piece. We got Rian Watt and David Boze here from the Economic Opportunity Institute and Washington Policy Center, and we're going to come right back, wrap it up, couple of headlines, something to smile about. Don't go away.
Why does healthcare cost so freaking much?
I don't understand any of it. Like, where did this number come from?
And what can we do about it?
I try and be a nice person, but health insurance does not bring out the best in me.
I'm Dan Weissman, host of An Arm and a Leg, a podcast about the high cost of healthcare. This year, we're partnering with KUOW to broaden the conversation. Catch us on the KUOW app or wherever you get podcasts.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books. Television host, guidebook author, and activist Rick Steves presents his new memoir, On the Hippie Trail, Istanbul to Kathmandu, and the Making of a Travel Writer, on February 25th at 7 p.m. Tickets available now at thirdplacebooks.com.
And from the Washington State Department of Revenue's Unclaimed Property Program, currently holding $2.4 billion in uncashed checks, insurance proceeds, forgotten deposits, and more for Washington residents and businesses. Learn more at claimyourcash.org.
KUOW's Week in Review. Washington Policy Center's David Boze, Seattle Times, Josh Farley, Economic Opportunity Institute's Rian Watt. What haven't we told you? Ryan, you mentioned the unionized Costco workers picketing outside corporate HQ in Issaquah. They're represented by the Teamsters, and they voted to walk out if they don't get a labor contract by the end of the month. We had the sentencing. A judge sentenced the former Auburn police officer found guilty of murder. This is Jeffrey Nelson, convicted of killing Jesse Saray. Nelson was the first officer in our state to be charged and convicted under this new legal standard for cops who use deadly force. Defense attorneys asked for 6.5 years, saying this officer thought he was fighting for his life. The judge sentenced Nelson to more than 16 years in prison. Let's see. Seahawks head coach Pete Carroll signed a deal to become the new head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. So get ready to root against Pete. The CEO of REI is retiring. Eric Art's leaving at the end of March. New president Mary Beth Lawton. Seattle Symphony's CEO is resigning. And I've only got time to ask you, what made you smile this week?
I've got a 3-month-old son at home. It's our first baby, and he's getting really much more active and much more vocal, and he's smiling and laughing at us. And so it's always nice when at least one person is always happy when you walk into the room, and that's where he is right now. So that made me smile.
That does help. Anyone else?
I say the same. My kids are always the reason I smile every week. They're great. I've got one of them here watching in the studio, and
I enjoyed meeting her.
Yeah, thanks. And so they're always fun.
I've been waving at her over behind your back while she's been peeking
good,
over.
Good. You just hey, the kids stroke the ego because they're like, you come home and you're the most important person in the world.
I have to level with you guys. I have the smartest, most beautiful 6-year-old that's ever existed in the history of the planet.
True.
And she loves taking public transit. And I also am smiling because I got to admit, I'm getting pretty excited about the prospect of light rail going from Federal Way to Linwood and beyond, and all the way to Redmond.
Across the lake.
Hopefully by World Cup next year. Maybe I'm being too optimistic. It has its problems, but I love that our light rail network is expanding here in the Puget Sound region.
My kids love the ferry.
Okay.
Nothing better than that.
Mine is just that KUOW's got a new podcast for your favorite people, children. It's about the collections at the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture, and the hosts open up the drawers of the freezers and the closets and tell you about the dinosaurs and the skeleton scouring beetles.
It's really satisfying to glue a dinosaur together and puzzle it back together, and it'll shine up just fine.
But the thing about putting a dinosaur together, you might find a leg bone or a horn or a tooth, but you almost never find all of the pieces you need to put it together.
This is a science town. We need a science podcast, and it's called Spectacular Specimens. And you and your children, even they know where to find podcasts, right?
That's a great idea. My kids know better than I do. It's crazy.
Exactly.
And my oldest one's 8.
Ask your kids how to get a podcast. Your app, our website, Spectacular Specimens. And we're out of here. Rian Watt, Executive Director of the Economic Opportunity Institute. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Josh Farley, Seattle Times opinion columnist and editorial board member. Thank you, Josh.
Love being with you, Bill.
You too. David Boze, Washington Policy Center Communications Director. You and your kid have a great weekend. Thank you for coming.
Hey, thanks.
David.
Love being here.
And producer Kevin Kniestet and Bernard Willett on the board, Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Hans Twite. Thank you to all of you. I'm Bill Radke. Thank you. Now I'm speaking to you, listener or viewer, if you're on YouTube. We really appreciate you dropping by. Let's do this again in a week for Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from the Jeanette Rankin Foundation, with King County Housing Authority and Highline College empowering women and non-binary students 35 and older to complete their college degrees and help transform their lives. More at rankinfoundation.org, transforming futures through education.
Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm Krupa Badi. UN peacekeepers in the Eastern Democratic